Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today is an Ask Me Anything episode, or AMA. This is part of our premium subscriber channel. Our premium subscriber channel was started in order to provide support for this standard Huberman Lab podcast, which comes out every Monday and is available at zero cost to everybody on all standard feeds, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and elsewhere. We also started the premium channel as a way to generate support for exciting research being done at Stanford and elsewhere. Research on human beings that leads to important discoveries that assist mental health, physical health, and performance. I'm also pleased to inform you that for every $1 the Huberman Lab Premium channel generates for research studies, the Tiny Foundation has agreed to match that amount. So now we are able to double the total amount of funding given to studies of mental health, physical health, and human performance. If you'd like to subscribe to the Huberman Lab Podcast Premium channel, please go to hubermanlab.com/premium. It is $10 a month to subscribe, or you can pay $100 all at once to get an entire 12-month subscription for a year. We also have a lifetime subscription model that is a one-time payment. And again, you can find that option at hubermanlab.com/premium. For those of you that are already subscribers to the premium channel, please go to hubermanlab.com/premium and download the premium subscription feed. And for those of you that are not Huberman Lab Podcast Premium subscribers, you can still hear the first 20 minutes of today's episode and determine whether or not becoming a premium subscriber is for you. So without further ado, let's get to answering your questions. The first question is about the pros and cons of daily caffeine consumption. The question reads, what is your opinion on the net benefit of daily caffeine consumption, and how can somebody determine if daily caffeine consumption is right for them? Well, first of all, I did an entire episode about caffeine. You can find that by going to hubermanlab.com. At that website, you can put in caffeine into the search function, and you'll find links to that episode in all the formats, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, etc. And it's timestamped, of course. You can navigate to the particular topics most of interest to you. However, for sake of this discussion, I can summarize a few of the key points. The most important thing to understand is that for most adults, so that is people about age 18 to 20 and older, daily caffeine consumption is not going to be a problem provided it does not induce anxiety, and certainly provided that it not induce anxiety or panic attacks, and provided that it does not disrupt your nighttime sleep. This is why I always recommend that if you are going to consume caffeine in any form, coffee, tea, soda, or otherwise, that you try not to ingest caffeine within the 8 and ideally within the 10 or even 12 hours prior to bedtime. That's because the half-life of caffeine is such that even if you are able to, for instance, have a cup of coffee around 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. and then fall asleep around midnight, the architecture of the sleep that you get is going to be disrupted. For instance, it is very important that you get sufficient amounts of both slow-wave deep sleep as well as rapid eye movement sleep each night. And if you consume caffeine too close to bedtime, and here I'm defining too close as anywhere from 8 to 12 hours before going to sleep, chances are you're not going to get as much rapid eye movement sleep or slow wave sleep that you would otherwise. And it is the amount of rapid eye movement sleep and slow wave sleep that together lead to whether or not you feel you had a good night's sleep in terms of your next day alertness and cognitive abilities. Now, again, some people may find that they can drink caffeine in the late afternoon, maybe even at night, and still fall asleep. But I promise you, even if you're in that category, you will sleep far better, meaning the architecture of your sleep will be better and you will feel far more rested the next day if you abstain from caffeine within the 8 to 12 hours prior to bedtime. And I should also say that none of us are perfect, myself included. I will sometimes have a cup of coffee in the late afternoon, and sometimes that will cause me to stay up a little bit later. Sometimes it won't. I don't think you want to obsess or worry too much about having some caffeine every once in a while in the late afternoon if you are still able to fall asleep, but don't make it a regular habit. Now, as far as we know, there is no drawback to consuming caffeine on a daily basis, again, provided it does not disrupt your nighttime sleep and provided that it does not induce anxiety. In fact, most of the world consumes caffeine every single day. The current estimates are that 90%, that's right, 90% of adults throughout the world consume a caffeinated beverage every single day. That's a staggeringly high number, making caffeine the most popular drug on the planet. In fact, because of the way that caffeine works, and just to remind you how it works, it effectively blocks adenosine receptors. Adenosine is a molecule that builds up in your brain and body more and more according to how long you've been awake. It makes you feel sleepy. Caffeine blocks the adenosine receptor, and then when it is dislodged from that receptor, whatever adenosine has built up and is around can then bind to the adenosine receptor and makes you feel very sleepy. That's the caffeine crash. So if 90% of the adult population of the planet Earth is consuming caffeine every day, that means 90% of the adult population of planet Earth is blocking their adenosine receptors for some portion of their daily life. And then their adenosine is binding to the vacant receptor once the caffeine has dislodged. And why are 90% of adult humans consuming caffeine every day? Well, to feel more energized, more focused, to have more both cognitive energy and physical energy. Now, of course, most people are not walking around thinking, oh, caffeine gives me more energy, more focus, etc. Most people are consuming caffeine every single day and are consuming caffeine every single day in order to feel, quote unquote, normal, to be at their baseline level of cognitive ability and physical energy and so on. In fact, if you look at the data on caffeine consumption, what you'll find is that caffeine actually is a cognitive enhancer. It can improve learning and memory. It can increase physical energy. It can increase mental and physical stamina. But a feature of those studies that's not often discussed, but that was, however, discussed in the full episode on caffeine, is that studies of caffeine typically are done by taking chronic caffeine users and then having them abstain from caffeine for some period of time, usually 4 days to 2 weeks, in which time they undergo caffeine withdrawal. They do not feel well. They get foggy headed. They have less energy. There's some malaise, sometimes even some mild depression. And then what they do is they have people take caffeine and take a cognitive exam or do some physical activity and compare their performance to what it was when they were in the withdrawal state. Another typical form of study on caffeine is to take people who are naive to caffeine or who never take caffeine and then have them ingest caffeine and then measure their cognitive and or physical performance. And in both cases, you see improvements. What I'm saying here is that daily caffeine consumption is not going to lead to improvements in cognitive ability or improvements in physical ability above one's baseline unless you either abstain from caffeine for some period of time, typically 4 days to 2 weeks prior, or you are not somebody who typically ingests caffeine. In other words, 90% of the world's population is drinking caffeine on a daily basis to be at their normal level of mental and physical functioning. So the question was, is there a net benefit to daily caffeine consumption? And here I can reliably say, provided you don't suffer from anxiety attacks or lack of sleep from the caffeine consumption, provided that you're mindful of not ingesting caffeine too late in the day, there doesn't seem to be any big drawback to drinking caffeine on a daily basis. However, there doesn't seem to be any great benefit, at least in terms of direct effects on cognitive or physical ability. Okay, so I realize this is a little bit of a convoluted answer, but we have to be honest with one another here. Caffeine is a performance-enhancing drug, but only when compared to the non-caffeinated state, and 90% of the adult population of the world is caffeinated. So adding more caffeine above what you would normally consume is certainly not going to allow you to think better and perform better physically. Here's a useful way to think about caffeine. Most people can pretty well tolerate doses of caffeine anywhere from 100 milligrams to 300 milligrams. Depends on body weight and depends on your tolerance. Tolerance, of course, based on how familiar you are with the effects of caffeine and how regularly you consume it. A typical cup of coffee, which by the way does not exist, depending on the vendor, depending on how much water to coffee ratio one uses, depending on whether or not it's French press or it's pour over, the type of coffee, et cetera, all of that is going to determine the total amount of caffeine in that coffee. But we can set some outer bounds on the total amount of caffeine that likely exists in a cup of coffee. And it's probably somewhere between 100 milligrams, that would be on the weaker side for a 6 or 8 ounce cup of coffee, out to about 300 milligrams for the equivalent 6 to 8 ounces of coffee. But if you were to brew your coffee very, very strong, or like me, occasionally throw a shot of espresso in there too, you could get that number up to 400 or 500 milligrams of caffeine. I personally tolerate caffeine pretty well. I've been drinking caffeine since I was a teenager, mostly in the form of brewed, unflavored yerba mate tea. It's important to stay away from the smoked varieties of yerba mate. If you're going to get your caffeine from yerba mate, the smoked varieties can be carcinogenic. The non-smoked varieties don't seem to have that property. But there's a lot of caffeine in yerba mate, so I'll drink yerba mate and have for many, many years, or I'll drink black coffee or espresso Americano, things of that sort. That's my preferred source of caffeine. Most people are drinking coffee to get their caffeine, and I would say that if you are going to drink your caffeine, drink it in the early part of the day. As I mentioned earlier, I am a big proponent of delaying your first caffeine intake until at least 90 minutes after waking in order to avoid the afternoon crash. I've talked a lot about this on the podcast. There are a lot of clips on the internet explaining the rationale behind that. And if you do experience an afternoon crash in energy, I do recommend delaying your morning caffeine intake to 90 to 120 minutes after waking. Now, for people that want to get more of a true cognitive enhancing and performance enhancing effect from caffeine, again, you're going to have to abstain from caffeine for about 4 days. For regular caffeine drinkers, that's going to be difficult, right? That is going to lead to headaches. That's going to lead to brain fog. That's going to lead to feelings of malaise. In fact, the last time I took 4 days off or even a week off from caffeine consumption was when I was sick. I don't get sick very often, but when I am sick, I generally abstain from caffeine. And sometimes I wonder whether or not the malaise I feel from whatever, viral or bacterial thing I might be dealing with when I'm sick is in part the malaise of caffeine withdrawal. I certainly notice I feel much better when I return to drinking caffeine, but that tends to coincide with feeling relief from whatever sinus symptoms and other symptoms I might have been experiencing from the illness. So it's not a good experiment. I can't tease apart those variables. So the short answer is, for most adults, there does not seem to be any major downside to consuming caffeine. And there have been scattered reports here and there in humans showing that ingesting caffeine can increase dopamine receptors, which will effectively allow you to get more out of the dopamine that you produce. This is why caffeine has a mood elevating as well as energy elevating effect. I should point out that some people just cannot tolerate caffeine. It makes them too jittery, too anxious. They start sweating, they get heart palpitations. It's very hard for these people to build up a tolerance to caffeine that allows them to enjoy it. These are the people that can even feel a fluttering of the heart and a lot of energy lift from decaf coffee, something that, to me is just a foreign concept, but some people are just that sensitive to caffeine that even the small amounts of caffeine in chocolate or decaf coffee make them feel too alert, and they should abstain from caffeine. I don't think they are in any way harming their health by abstaining from caffeine. Then there's the issue of children and adolescents and teenagers and young adults ingesting caffeine. And I covered some of this in the episode about caffeine, but there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not caffeine can cause osteoporosis, whether or not it can leach calcium out of the bones, whether or not it can stunt growth. Frankly, there's not a lot of evidence for those sorts of claims. And yet the developing brain is a very tender and malleable environment. And as somebody who started off his career as a developmental neurobiologist studying developmental brain plasticity and wiring, it does sort of make me cringe to think about children younger than the age of, say, 14, ingesting large amounts of caffeine in any form, soda, coffee, tea, etc., despite the fact that there's very little evidence that it can stunt their growth. I don't personally like the idea of the young brain being bathed in an adenosine receptor antagonist, which is effectively what caffeine is. As much as possible, one wants the developing brain to develop in a milieu of unencumbered, non-chemically encumbered interactions between neurotransmitters and their receptors, unless, of course, there's a clinical need for a prescription drug or a supplement or some modification of a nutritional program specifically to up or down regulate the dopamine system or up or down regulate the serotonin system. But those are the sorts of decisions that really should be made in close oversight and recommendations by a psychiatrist. So the short answer around daily caffeine consumption in young people, meaning 14 and younger, is avoid it if you can. Have your children avoid caffeine if they can. The occasional bit of caffeine is probably not going to be a problem. The amount of caffeine in small amounts of chocolate, probably not going to be a problem. But caffeine in the form of energy drinks, sodas, coffee, tea for children younger than 14 just seems like a bad idea from everything we understand about brain wiring and the trajectories of brains that develop with a lot of chemical adjustment from other sources like caffeine. Now, for kids age 15 to say 18 or 20, a lot of brain wiring is still occurring, but a lot of it has been completed. So probably not as risky to consume caffeine every once in a while, or maybe even on a daily basis. But there too, I think there are great advantages to limiting the amount of caffeine that one ingests. And of course, in the adolescent and teen years. Nowadays, a lot of kids are consuming energy drinks and soda. And some of those energy drinks and sodas contain a lot of caffeine, anywhere from 200 to 800 milligrams of caffeine. And nowadays, more sodas and energy drinks contain other things like amino acid precursors to neuromodulators like dopamine. So for instance, a lot of energy drinks now contain L-tyrosine, which is a precursor to dopamine. A lot of them will contain theanine. I've talked about theanine as a supplement that can promote more restful sleep if taken 30 to 60 minutes before sleep. The reason why a lot of energy drinks and sodas, and frankly now coffee brands, are including theanine in the coffee or energy drink or soda is because it tends to have a mild anxiety reducing effect, and it reduces the jitters that caffeine creates. And so that's actually a trick that these companies are using in order to get people to ingest more caffeine, because by including the theanine, it's preventing the kid or adult from feeling too jittery, and therefore they can continue to consume that drink without feeling like they're overstimulated. So if I were to take the parental neuroscientist adult voice here, I would say avoid caffeine intake as much as you can until you're about 18 years old. But I'm realistic. I realize that adolescents and teens, age say 14 or 15 out to 18 and older, are going to be consuming caffeine in the form of energy drinks and sodas. But reducing the total amount of caffeine that one is ingesting in those years, it just seems really advantageous. Again, for all the same reasons I mentioned earlier, you don't want the young brain bathing in a bunch of exogenous, meaning externally introduced neurochemicals, or in things like theanine or L-tyrosine. If you're going to indulge in caffeine or in energy drinks or theanine or L-tyrosine for that matter, that's the sort of thing that probably is best left for people 18 and older. And even there, if one finds that caffeine is for them, as do I think always best to try and get your caffeine from a clean source meaning something that contains just coffee or just tea. Again, this isn't a knock on energy drinks specifically, but you really have to make sure that whatever energy drink you're going to consume, you know what's in it, you recognize what the different ingredients do, and you recognize the potential of ingesting those ingredients chronically over and over again. And I've talked a little bit about this on previous podcasts, and I'll get into this again. Maybe we'll do an entire episode about energy drinks because they are so commonly consumed nowadays. Now, getting back to the original question about daily caffeine consumption, this person goes on to say that for them, okay, this is their personal experience, after a few weeks of consumption of daily caffeine, the negatives start to outweigh the positive ones. They're getting poor quality sleep, lack of appetite, anxiety, etc. And when they don't consume caffeine, they find it a lot easier to be mindful, and their meditation practice is much better, but they're lethargic and less motivated. Okay, so what they're describing are all the classic symptoms of caffeine overuse. Probably not abuse in this case, although caffeine can be truly abused. People taking caffeine pills, etc., in large quantities. We're not talking about that. But this person is describing the classic pattern of overuse of caffeine and the classic pattern of withdrawal from caffeine when they stop taking it. So what should somebody like this do? And I think that's an important question to answer, because I think a lot of people fall into this category. They drink caffeine every day. They're no longer getting the performance enhancing effect of caffeine, so they're taking it just to be normal or feel like they can focus normally and have normal amounts of energy. But then if they try and come off, they feel worse. Okay, there are a couple ways to do this. You can taper your caffeine intake off over the course of 4 to 7 days. But most people don't have the discipline or don't want to spend the time doing that. But if you want to, the way you would do that is you would cut it by about 10 or 15% per day. You could do that by volume, or you could do that by concentration of coffee, that sort of thing. A simpler way to go about all this that still will allow you to get some of the performance enhancing effects of caffeine and yet experience far less withdrawal would be two things. First of all, just have your amount of caffeine intake for 2 or 3 days. So again, that could be by volume or it could be by concentration. Probably easiest to do by volume. And so instead of drinking an 8-ounce coffee in the morning, maybe you do 4 ounces of regular coffee, 4 ounces of decaf, or you just have the 4 ounces of coffee. You do that for 3 or 4 days, and then you take perhaps 1 full day off from caffeine, maybe another full day off. You're going to feel a lot less bad on those 2 days, having cut your caffeine intake in half in the previous 4 days than you would if you just went cold turkey. And then you go back to ingesting caffeine, but you go back to ingesting caffeine at that 50% dose, or what used to represent that 50% dose of caffeine for you. And you just continue that way on a daily basis. And then every once in a while, when you want the performance enhancing effects of caffeine, you go back to what was your original dose, which is now double what you're taking on a daily basis. So what we're really talking about here is not going cold turkey. We're not talking about quitting caffeine indefinitely. What we're talking about is cutting the amount of caffeine that you drink in half for about 4 days, okay, plus or minus a day, and then taking 2 days off from caffeine completely, and then going back on that half dose of caffeine indefinitely. That's your new baseline of caffeine intake. And then every once in a while, if you need a bit more of a lift, you ingest twice as much caffeine or a coffee that's twice as concentrated. We should acknowledge that most people aren't going to be really precise about the amount of ounces and the amount of caffeine. Nonetheless, it's pretty straightforward to know that you're reducing your caffeine intake. It certainly is clear to know if you're ingesting no caffeine for a couple of days. And it's pretty clear when you're doubling the amount of caffeine, but you don't have to worry so much that you're exactly doubling the amount of caffeine. You could drink 1.5 times as much as you happen to drink on the day before, or you could drink 3 times as much. You would definitely feel it if you drink 3 times as much. One very important thing to recognize is that on any day where you really spike your caffeine intake above baseline, no matter where that baseline is when you start, could be 0, could be 400 milligrams, could be 200 milligrams. When you double that intake, you will get a big boost of energy, and the next day, you're going to feel the crash from that. You're going to feel more lethargic. You're going to feel not so good. This has to do with dopamine receptor modulation. This has to do with adenosine receptor modulation. The important thing to do is not continue to consume that elevated level of caffeine, which is what most people do, and then they set a new higher baseline just to feel normal. The key thing is to just manage to get through that crash day, manage to get through that one day where you feel a little less good or maybe even down a bit. Get outside a bit, get some more sunshine. We know that spikes your cortisol in a good way, right? It can increase the catecholamines, dopamine, et cetera. Get a little bit more sunlight, get a little bit more movement, get outside, do something to offset those feelings of malaise, and then get right back to your original goal level of caffeine each day. There's no use in getting so quantitative that you make your life miserable, measuring things out like a laboratory chemist. If you're that type and you want to do that, be my guest. But unless you're taking caffeine in pill form, it's very, very hard to get extremely exact about the amounts of caffeine that you're ingesting. So it is okay to eyeball it, but understand the contour of how caffeine works and what the caffeine performance enhancing effect comes from. It comes from a caffeine intake above baseline. Understand that anytime you go above baseline with your caffeine intake, there's the potential of some anxiety. Understand that there's going to be a slight withdrawal effect that lasts about 24 to 48 hours. Battle through that short period, and you'll be right back where you started and where you need to be so that you can enjoy caffeine on a daily basis and derive the benefits, because there are many benefits to drinking caffeine, and avoiding some of the potential hazards. And again, if you're a young person, I recommend delaying that caffeine intake, maybe, 10 years. Thank you for joining for the beginning of this Ask Me Anything episode. To hear the full episode and to hear future episodes of these Ask Me Anything sessions, plus to receive transcripts of them and transcripts of the Huberman Lab podcast standard channel and premium tools not released anywhere else, please go to hubermanlab.com/premium. Just to remind you why we launched the Huberman Lab podcast premium channel, it's really twofold. First of all, it's to raise support for the standard Huberman Lab podcast channel, which of course will still be continued to be released every Monday in full length. We are not going to change the format or anything about the standard Huberman Lab podcast. And to fund research, in particular research done on human beings, so not animal models, but on human beings, which I think we all agree is the species that we are most interested in. And we are going to specifically fund research that is aimed toward developing further protocols for mental health, physical health, and performance. And those protocols will be distributed through all channels, not just the premium channel, but through all channels, Huberman Lab podcast and other media channels. So the idea here is to give you information to your burning questions in depth and allow you the opportunity to support the kind of research that provides those kinds of answers in the first place. Now, an especially exciting feature of the premium channel is that the Tiny Foundation has generously offered to do a dollar-for-dollar match on all funds raised for research through the premium channel. So this is a terrific way that they're going to amplify whatever funds come in through the premium channel to further support research for science and science-related tools for mental health, physical health, and performance. If you'd like to sign up for the Huberman Lab premium channel, Again, there's a cost of $10 per month, or you can pay $100 up front for the entire year. That will give you access to all the AMAs. You can ask questions and get answers to your questions, and you'll, of course, get answers to all the questions that other people ask as well. There will also be some premium content, such as transcripts of the AMAs and various transcripts and protocols of Huberman Lab podcast episodes not found elsewhere. And again, you'll be supporting research for mental health, physical health, and performance. You can sign up for the premium channel by going to hubermanlab.com/premium. Again, that's hubermanlab.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your interest. Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today is an Ask Me Anything episode, or AMA. This is part of our premium subscriber channel. Our premium subscriber channel was started in order to provide support for this standard Huberman Lab podcast, which comes out every Monday and is available at zero cost to everybody on all standard feeds, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and elsewhere. We also started the premium channel as a way to generate support for exciting research being done at Stanford and elsewhere, research on human beings that leads to important discoveries that assist mental health, physical health, and performance. I'm also pleased to inform you that for every dollar the Huberman Lab Premium channel generates for research studies, the Tiny Foundation has agreed to match that amount. So now we are able to double the total amount of funding given to studies of mental health, physical health, and human performance. If you'd like to subscribe to the Huberman Lab Podcast Premium channel, please go to hubermanlab.com/premium. It is $10 a month to subscribe, or you can pay $100 all at once to get an entire 12-month subscription for a year. We also have a lifetime subscription model that is a one-time payment. And again, you can find that option at hubermanlab.com/premium. For those of you that are already subscribers to the premium channel, please go to hubermanlab.com/premium and download the premium subscription feed. And for those of you that are not Huberman Lab Podcast Premium subscribers, you can still hear the first 20 minutes of today's episode and determine whether or not becoming a premium subscriber is for you. So without further ado, let's get to answering your questions. The first question is about Kratom, and the question is, what are the short and long-term effects of taking Kratom? For those of you that haven't heard of Kratom, Kratom is a substance that comes from a tree that grows naturally in Indonesia. The tree itself is called Mitragyna speciosa, and it's been known for hundreds of years or more. We don't really know how long, but at least for a couple of hundred years, that when people chew the leaves of this tree, they experience a mild stimulant effect. And there's also a process of extraction whereby you can take the leaves and get high concentrations of kratom that nowadays is packaged into various supplements, most often consumed in capsule form, although sometimes it's sold in raw powder form. Here's the key thing to understand about kratom. Indeed, at low dosages, kratom has a mild stimulant effect. However, at higher dosages, it has what's called an analgesic effect, that is a pain-killing effect, and it acts as a sedative. And kratom itself acts as an opioid in the body. This is what's making kratom a very controversial topic these days. In particular, because most people have heard of the so-called opioid crisis. The opioid crisis has been a term coined to largely center around issues that have taken place in the United States, although these issues definitely extend beyond the borders of the United States. But the opioid crisis is essentially the overconsumption and widespread addiction to opioids. Opioids include things like morphine, oxycodone, also called OxyContin, and there are other opioids similar to those compounds, all of which have the general effect of being painkillers and sedatives, and in some people, again, some people, eliciting a sense of euphoria, in particular at low to moderate dosages. However, people quickly develop a tolerance to those drugs and need to consume more and more of them in order to get the effect that they initially got from a lower dosage. And they are not just highly habit-forming, they are highly addictive. And we can distinguish between habit-forming and addictive by simply saying that addictive means people will continue to take something or do something despite negative consequences. There are other relevant definitions of addiction as well. I define addiction more broadly as the progressive narrowing of the things that give you pleasure. And indeed, when people get addicted to opioids, it is a very bad picture. It often hampers many, many areas of their lives, and seriously so. So the opioid crisis refers to the overprescription of opioid drugs. That's sort of what it's generally taken to mean, but it also includes accessing opioids such as morphine, oxycodone, etc., through gray market sources, through black market sources, and on and on. And of course, The acquisition of the drugs is just one piece. It's also the overconsumption of those drugs and, of course, the addiction to those drugs, which has proved to be so pernicious. So what does this have to do with kratom? Kratom is also an opioid, and we'll talk about how it differs in its opioid properties from the drugs I just talked about, because it is different from morphine and hydrocodone, but it also has some similar properties as well. But the deal with kratom is that a good number of people out there have managed to wean themselves off opioids such as morphine and hydrocodone through the use of kratom. And that has been used as justification for keeping kratom on the market and keeping it legal. However, and this is a very important however, kratom itself has also proved to be not only habit forming, but addictive, especially when taken at dosages that exceed that lower dose that just generally creates a bit of stimulant, a little bit of euphoric effect. When people start taking higher dosages of kratom, it is very clear that it does become addictive, and itself is very hard to come off of, so much so that people experience so-called kratom withdrawal. Now, the reason I mentioned that kratom has been used by a good number of people to wean themselves off of the more potent forms of prescription opioids is that when I solicited for questions about kratom on social media, it was a very binary response. In fact, there was one camp, a very rabid camp, that said, kratom is terrible. I took this stuff. I got addicted. It was extremely hard to come off of. There were additional comments in there, such as, I know somebody who literally had to go to rehab because of kratom, who developed a bunch of other addictions because of kratom. Essentially, many, many responses of people who had only bad experiences with kratom, meaning they liked it enough at first that they continued to take it, and it became addictive for them or somebody that they know. However, there was another camp that was equally vocal, which kept saying, no, if one really adheres to the lower dosages of kratom, kratom itself can be a useful tool for getting off other opioids. And there were even a few bona fide medical professionals, medical doctors that is, and I happen to know them and their reputations as quite good, who chimed in and sort of reconciled the two camps by saying, indeed, if one can avoid taking kratom at all, you should. There is no reason to take this thing thinking that it's quote unquote good for you. You would be wise to avoid taking it because there is a high probability if you take it at a given dosage or at a dosage that is going to get your brain and body into a state of euphoria, analgesia, and the sort of classic opioid effect, that it's going to become habit forming or addicting for you. That said, these same medical professionals acknowledged that a fair number of people that they knew managed to get off of the more potent forms of opioids, such as morphine, oxycodone, and so forth, using kratom. And they said, well, if it's a choice between being addicted to morphine and hydrocodone versus taking kratom and addicted to those substances, and kratom somehow allowed them to taper off of those substances, that they would look more favorably upon kratom if and only if they would also commit to progressively lowering their dose of kratom and eventually coming off of kratom. So the general takeaway from all of that is, if you can avoid taking kratom, meaning if you haven't taken it already, don't. And that reminds me of a very important point, which a guest on the Huberman Lab podcast, Dr. Robert Merlenka, who's a MD and PhD, he's my colleague at Stanford School of Medicine. He's a world expert on the mechanisms underlying addiction and dopamine and drug reinforcement, among many other things. What he said on the podcast is absolutely true, which is that it is impossible to get addicted to a substance that you've never consumed. That might seem obvious, but think about that one again. It is impossible to get addicted to a substance that you've never consumed. So I think the safest statement to make is, if you have not tried kratom, you would be wise to avoid it because you stand a chance to become addicted to it. If, however, you are somebody that's addicted to other forms of opioids, you absolutely should talk to your physician about that and how to get off of those opioids. But there is evidence that some people have used kratom to successfully wean themselves off the more potent forms of opioids that I talked about, namely morphine and hydrocodone, as well as a few others. Now, if you're somebody who already takes kratom, you need to be very thoughtful about the dosage that you take. And you also need to be thoughtful about the fact that people differ dramatically in their response to opioids. This is oh so important, and people do not talk about this enough. We hear, for instance, that, if people are taking anywhere from 1 to 5 grams, maybe 1 to 6 grams of kratom per day, that's keeping it in the dosage range for which people don't generally tend to get addicted. You'll hear things like that. And by the way, when I say 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 grams per day, I'm not talking about the individual compounds that are present in kratom. There are a couple of different plant alkaloids I'll talk about in a moment that are present in kratom, and these have different effects on the opioid system. So nowadays, some of the companies that sell kratom, and by the way, this is sold over the counter as a supplement. It does not require a prescription to purchase, at least at this point in time in the United States. Some of these products will have a higher concentration of one or the other alkaloids within them, such that you can't really compare 1 gram of one brand of kratom to 1 gram of another brand of kratom, because they can have wildly different levels of these different alkaloids, and these different alkaloids have wildly different impact on different aspects of your brain and body biology. In particular, how much they tend to impact the so-called endogenous opioid system. Okay, so when we talk about dosages, we have to keep this in the back of our mind, and we have to keep in the back of our mind that there does seem to be a subgroup of people. We don't know how big this subgroup of people is, but we know it's not everyone, but it's somewhere between 10 and 40% of people seem to respond to opioids in a particularly potent way. They really like them. And perhaps not surprisingly, people outside of that category don't tend to like opioids. I can certainly say that I am somebody who, when I've been prescribed things like Vicodin or any other opioid post-surgery for pain, I hate taking those drugs. I absolutely hate it. I'd rather deal with the pain. They make me nauseous. They make me feel terrible. That said, I know people who love opioids. It's like a natural fit for their chemistry in the sense that it tends to evoke more euphoria. They just immediately like the feeling. Some of you may remember the episode of the Huberman Lab podcast that I did about alcohol. And there too, I discussed the fact that about 8 to 10% of people who consume alcohol get an increased dopamine response to alcohol that's not observed in other people. And that particular subgroup of people is very, very at risk for developing alcohol use disorder, sometimes called alcoholism, because they can drink in a way and they experience a high from drinking in a way that other people simply do not experience. Now, like everybody else, if they consume too much alcohol, they get drunk. So it's not about the drunk effect. It's about the dopamine and other sorts of chemicals that are released in those people in response to alcohol that other people just don't seem to experience at the same level of potency. So again, with things like kratom and the other opioids, there's a category of people, and it's a much larger category of people. Again, 10 to 40%. We don't know exactly how many because the studies are not really completed and there aren't enough of those studies yet, unfortunately. But when those people take an opioid, wow, oh wow, do they like it. And those people in particular are very much at risk for developing an addiction to opioids. And so those people especially should never, ever go near kratom if they haven't, or if they are already taking kratom. These are the people that are constantly ratcheting up their dose. These are the people that tell you, no, I'm not addicted. But if you were to say, hey, all right, well, then let's do an experiment where you don't take kratom for a week. Those are going to be the people that are suddenly going to get anxious about the mere idea of that. I've also talked about this in reference to cannabis when I did an episode about cannabis. Again, I'm not putting a blanket statement out there about cannabis as being good or bad. On that episode, I talked about the fact that cannabis does indeed have various therapeutic uses, but that there are a good number of people who rely on cannabis for anxiety control and other ways of modulating their brain chemistry and bodily chemistry, such that if you were to say, hey, are you addicted to cannabis? They'd say, no, I don't have to smoke cannabis. I don't have to take my edibles. But if you were to push them a little bit and say, all right, well then, let's do an experiment where you don't consume any cannabis in any form for 10 days. They don't like the idea of that experiment at all. So much so that were they to run that experiment, they would experience a lot of the withdrawal symptoms associated with addiction. So I can't in good faith say that kratom is safe for everybody because it is simply not. Now, is it safer than the other opioids? And if so, why? Well, in order to address that, let's take a short glance at the pharmacology of kratom and how it works in terms of its neurochemistry in the body. And I'm going to keep this pretty brief because in the future, I'm going to do an extended episode all about opioids, and I will include kratom in that conversation. But just to back up a little bit and discuss what opioids are compounds that can activate the so-called endogenous opioid system. All of us have within our brain and body the capacity to release our own opioids. That's right. You have opioids within your body. They are released from neurons and they bind to so-called opioid receptors. So perhaps some of you have heard of the so-called runner's high. The runner's high is a euphoric state. It's a fairly mild euphoric state in most cases, but it's a euphoric state induced by long duration effort, aka the runner's high. The runner's high is just a phrase used to explain that when we engage in long duration repetitive action effort, the body starts releasing these endogenous opioids. They bind to receptors and they trigger things like analgesia, relief from pain. They trigger mild euphoria. They tend to change our perception of the outside world, make things look more beautiful, shiny. They give things a little bit of a sheen. What I just described is a mild version of what people experience when they take something like morphine. When people take morphine, there's more of a sedative effect, there's more of a euphoric effect, and there's more of a dreamlike effect. And again, it will depend on dosage. Kratom and morphine and hydrocodone all have the property of acting like the endogenous opioids, but at much higher potency. When you bring them into your system, they cross the blood-brain barrier, so they go into the brain, and they bind to a number of different opioid receptors. There's the mu opioid receptor. By the way, these names all follow Greek alphabet letters. So the mu opioid receptor, the kappa opioid receptor, there are a bunch of different ones. Kratom binds preferentially to the mu opioid receptor and somewhat to the kappa opioid receptor. There's a big misconception out there. A lot of people, especially people who are proponents of Kratom, will say, no, morphine and hydrocodone bind the mu opioid receptor, whereas Kratom binds the kappa opioid receptor. So it's a different compound, very, very different. Not true. Not true. Kratom, morphine, and hydrocodone all bind to the mu opioid receptor. And that's what's largely responsible for its opioid-like effects, especially when you get the dosage up to a level where you start getting the mild sedation, the analgesia, the pain relief. And keep in mind, a lot of people are taking Kratom because they want pain relief. And when that mu opioid receptor system is activated, it indirectly activates a lot of the reinforcement circuitry in the brain that relates to dopamine and serotonin. This is another area that we'll go into in more depth in the future, but there's been a lot of controversy. People saying, oh, Kratom doesn't trigger the dopamine system, therefore it's not addictive. But that is simply not true. It indirectly activates the reinforcement circuitry that includes both dopamine and serotonin, but its primary effect is to hit this mu opioid receptor system that exists in a bunch of places in the brain, but mainly in the brainstem and a structure called the periaqueductal gray nucleus, which then provides pain relief. It triggers a number of different shifts in cognition. It's what creates that mild euphoria, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how can we be so confident that Kratom is acting so similarly to hydrocodone and to morphine, albeit with lower potency? And the reason is, if you give people a drug that blocks the mu opioid receptor prior to them taking Kratom, they don't experience any of the classic effects of taking Kratom. No euphoria, no analgesia, no sedation, even at the low dosages, no mild stimulant effect. So we really have to look at Kratom as an opioid. Okay, that's just the honest truth. And if you're somebody who doesn't like this message because you like Kratom, I'm not telling you that you don't like Kratom. I'm telling you, you likely like Kratom because it's an opioid. So again, if you go online and you start asking questions about Kratom, again, you're going to see these two camps. You're going to see the Kratom is terrible, it's addictive, it's everything bad camp. And then you're going to see the other camp out there, very vocal as well, talking about how Kratom helped them avoid other things that are worse. And, this is an argument that, frankly, I don't think we want to lean on, right? The idea that substance A is not as bad as substance B, and that making substance A unavailable is just going to send everyone running for substance B, that's a weak argument, frankly, right? I heard this argument around cannabis. And by the way, I think pretty balanced about cannabis. If you listen to the episode I did on cannabis, I think you'll agree that I believe that cannabis has its therapeutic applications. I also believe that young people, especially young males with a predisposition to psychosis, should not be taking high concentration THC cannabis because the data tell us they are already at risk of psychosis and they are at a much greater risk of psychosis if they do. So I think I'm pretty balanced about the story on cannabis. But I often hear the argument, oh, cannabis isn't as bad as alcohol, and therefore cannabis is good. That's simply not rational. What we should be saying is whether or not it's cannabis or alcohol or kratom or any substance for that matter, what are the potential benefits? What are the potential risks? And Again, this is far too much than we can go into in this AMA, and we will go into in a future full-length episode of the Huberman Lab podcast. But the other thing to really keep in mind is the lack of regulation over kratom supplements. Now, as many of you know, I am a fan of many, not all, but many supplements in certain conditions. I always say behaviors first, then nutrition, then if and only if it's needed, rely on supplementation. But supplementation is a big category. But when we're talking about supplements that are opioid compounds, I start to get nervous because of the high abuse potential and the high addiction potential of opioids. And kratom is included in that category. A couple of other key notes about kratom. While death directly from kratom is fairly rare, it has happened. Now, hydrocodone and morphine suppress respiration, actually suppress breathing by way of a mechanism that if you're a listener of the Huberman Lab podcast, you know about, which is the so-called physiological sigh. Many of you have heard me talk about the physiological sigh as something that you do voluntarily, the double inhale through the nose and then a long exhale in order to rapidly reduce your level of stress. As far as we know, that's the fastest way to deliberately lower your level of stress. But the physiological sigh was discovered in the 1930s as a spontaneous pattern of breathing that occurs involuntarily in sleep in order to reinflate the lungs and offload carbon dioxide and bring oxygen back into the system on the subsequent breath. When I interviewed Dr. Jack Feldman, who is a professor at University of California, Los Angeles, and really the pioneer of the modern neuroscience understanding of respiration, he talked about some studies in his laboratory that were exploring why people die when taking opioids. This is a major issue associated with the opioid crisis. And what he mentioned was that the opioids bind to particular receptors in the brainstem locations that generate physiological sighs. So opioids, when taken as drugs, suppress physiological sighing and do so during sleep, and lack of adequate respiration, meaning people stop breathing during sleep, is one of the primary reasons why people die when they take opioids. Now, kratom is not known to suppress respiration when taken at low to moderate dosages, but when combined with any other opioids, and certainly when combined with alcohol, it can suppress respiration. And while the data on this are fairly scant, there is some evidence that kratom-induced death is caused by suppression of the respiration system. So again, death due to taking kratom at the dosages that are recommended on most commercial packaging is fairly rare, although it has happened. It's unclear if it happened because it was taken in combination with other compounds. That seems likely. But we can't forget that a lot of people are taking kratom at much higher dosages, and in fact, progressively higher and higher dosages from these over-the-counter sources. And with increased dosage, there is, yes, an increased risk of respiratory failure. So again, all of this points to the fact that kratom is simply not a benign substance. So if we're going to be very honest, the addictive potential of kratom is real. It is exacerbated for some people compared to others, but it is real. Its very similarities to other more potent forms of opioids are what make it attractive for some people who are trying to come off those more potent form of opioids. But the goal, of course, is to completely come off all opioids. And kratom itself can be a bit of a trap. It can be a trap in the sense that people who have never taken other opioids can become addicted to kratom itself. That is absolutely clear. That can happen. It has happened in a great number of people. It's also clear that kratom can potentially be a trap. Notice I said potentially, because if people are trying to come off other more potent forms of opioids and then they use kratom to do that, and then they're ratcheting up their dosage of kratom such that they're now matching the endogenous response to kratom in a way that doesn't really distinguish from the effects that they were getting from morphine and hydrocodone, well, then they're just using a different form of morphine and hydrocodone. And I'm sure that some of you are out there saying that is ridiculous. You cannot compare the effects of kratom to the effects of hydrocodone, but the potency is about 1/6 of hydrocodone. And there are people out there who are just increasing both the dosage and modifying the type of kratom that they're taking so that they're getting the kratom that has a particularly high concentration of one of the alkaloids that hits that mu opioid receptor hardest. And in doing so, sure, they're not getting the pure hydrocodone effect, but they're getting really close. So my advice would be, if you haven't touched kratom, don't touch it at all, ever. If you are taking kratom, you need to take note of what we just discussed. Thank you for joining for the beginning of this Ask Me Anything episode. To hear the full episode and to hear future episodes of these Ask Me Anything sessions, plus to receive transcripts of them and transcripts of the Huberman Lab podcast standard channel and premium tools not released anywhere else, please go to hubermanlab.com/premium. Just to remind you why we launched the Huberman Lab podcast premium channel, it's really twofold. First of all, it's to raise support for the standard Huberman Lab podcast channel, which of course will still be continued to be released every Monday in full length. We are not going to change the format or anything about the standard Huberman Lab podcast. And to fund research, in particular research done on human beings, so not animal models, but on human beings, which I think we all agree is the species that we are most interested in. And we are going to specifically fund research that is aimed toward developing further protocols for mental health, physical health, and performance. And those protocols will be distributed through all channels, not just the premium channel, but through all channels, Huberman Lab podcast and other media channels. So the idea here is to give you information to your burning questions in depth and allow you the opportunity to support the kind of research that provides those kinds of answers in the first place. Now, an especially exciting feature of the premium channel is that the Tiny Foundation has generously offered to do a dollar-for-dollar match on all funds raised for research through the premium channel. So this is a terrific way that they're going to amplify whatever funds come in through the premium channel to further support research for science and science-related tools for mental health, physical health, and performance. If you'd like to sign up for the Huberman Lab premium channel, again, there's a cost of $10 per month, or you can pay $100 up front for the entire year. That will give you access to all the AMAs. You can ask questions and get answers to your questions. And you'll, of course, get answers to all the questions that other people ask as well. There will also be some premium content, such as transcripts of the AMAs and various transcripts and protocols of Huberman Lab podcast episodes not found elsewhere. And again, you'll be supporting research for mental health, physical health, and performance. You can sign up for the premium channel by going to hubermanlab.com/premium. Again, that's hubermanlab.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your interest in science.